Whether or not it's good for us, the fact is that most people are still going to drink coffee either way. So in today's video, I'm not here to tell you whether or not you should be drinking coffee. Instead, I'm going to break down the 8 best practices you can use when making or ordering your coffee. That way, if you are someone who does drink coffee, you can completely avoid or at least minimize many of the issues coffee can cause. If you're drinking it wrong, it can be seriously problematic to your sleep, digestion, energy levels, gut health, body composition, and just your overall health. But by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to do to best avoid all of these issues. So let's not waste any time and get straight into the first best practice. One of the most important factors in order to minimize the negative effects of coffee is actually the time you drink it. You could have the cleanest coffee on earth, but if you drink it at the wrong time, you'll still experience many negative effects, such as in this study here, which found that people consuming coffee even 6 hours before bed experienced significantly worse sleep quality of over 8.5% and reduced their total sleep time by over an hour compared to people who stopped consuming coffee earlier in the day. The timing of coffee is important for 2 key reasons. Firstly, have you ever noticed your energy crash around 2 p.m? That's probably from drinking coffee at the wrong time. Secondly, some days, even after a full 8 hours of sleep, you still wake up feeling off. Again, likely caused by drinking coffee at the wrong time. So, when is the right time to drink it? The reason coffee can mess with both your energy and your sleep comes down to one key compound: caffeine. Now, everyone's heard of caffeine, but most people don't actually know how it works. And once you understand it and you time your intake of caffeine right, you can avoid a lot of the negative side effects that come from coffee. So, here's how caffeine works. Your body naturally produces a chemical called adenosine. Think of it as your sleepy hormone. As it builds up in your brain and attaches to adenosine receptors, you start to feel tired. But here's the key. You only feel tired when adenosine binds to those receptors, not just from it floating around. Caffeine has a very similar structure to adenosine. So when you drink it, caffeine blocks these receptors before adenosine can attach to them. Think of it like a parking lot. Adenosine and caffeine are both cars. The receptors are the parking spaces. If caffeine parks there first, adenosine has nowhere to go. And as a result, you don't feel tired. This is why caffeine appears to give you energy. It blocks your sleepy hormone. But here's the catch. When you first wake up, those parking spots already have some adenosine in them. This right here is why you still feel a bit groggy when you first wake up in the morning. If you drink coffee first thing in the morning, you block your body from naturally clearing out that leftover adenosine. Then later, once this caffeine's worn off, all that built up adenosine rushes back in at once. That right there is when you crash. Your energy tanks, your focus disappears, you have those mood dips. To avoid that crash, all you have to do is wait 90 to 120 minutes after waking before having your first cup. This gives your body time to clear most of that adenosine out on its own. So when you do have caffeine, it gives you the alertness without the crash. Now you might be thinking, what's the point of coffee if I can't have it right when I wake up? And I mean, if you drink coffee first thing in the morning and you're not dealing with these energy crashes, you don't have anxiety and you don't have the focus issues later in the day, you're probably fine. But if you are noticing these symptoms, delaying your first cup of coffee is one of the easiest fixes. So that's the first best practice. If you are someone who has afternoon energy crashes, delay your first cup of coffee for 90 to 120 minutes after waking. So now we know the best time to start drinking coffee. But what is the best time to have your final cup? In my opinion, this is the most important factor to consider when it comes to coffee consumption. When you drink coffee, the caffeine stays in your system way longer than most people realize. Caffeine has a half-life of about 6 hours, which means if you drink a cup at 2 p.m, half of that caffeine is still in your body at 8 p.m. It also has a quarter life of 12 hours, meaning that a quarter of the caffeine is still in your body at 2 a.m. The problem with this is your body has a natural way of making you feel tired. It's the buildup of adenosine that we talked about earlier. The more this adenosine builds up, the sleepier you feel. That's how your body signals it's time to rest. But when you drink coffee, caffeine blocks adenosine from doing its job. So even if your body is tired, you don't feel it. This right here is a huge reason why so many people struggle to fall asleep at night. In fact, in this meta-analysis with 22 studies looking at how coffee affects sleep, they found that having caffeine close to bedtime cuts your total sleep time down by an average of 45 minutes. But here's the thing, even if you can fall asleep easily after having a cup of coffee right before bed, just by having this caffeine in your system, especially if you've had it late in the day, can seriously wreck your overall sleep quality. I've experienced this myself. If I have caffeine too late in the day, I'll fall asleep straight away. I'll sleep for 8 hours, but then the next morning I'll wake up and I just won't feel as good. I'll feel a lot more sluggish and I find it's much harder to get out of bed. This is because caffeine too close to bedtime ruins deep sleep. This matters a lot because during deep sleep, your body repairs itself. It balances hormones. It repairs muscle tissue as well as other tissues. It also clears out brain waste through the lymphatic system. This system only turns on efficiently during your deep sleep. If you miss it, your brain can't properly detox. It also can't repair or regenerate itself effectively, which over time leads to a toxin buildup. That same meta-analysis we looked at before also looked at how caffeine affects your overall sleep quality. What it found was a 7% drop-off in sleep efficiency and a loss of around 11 minutes of deep sleep. Now, that might not sound too bad. 11 minutes, that doesn't sound like a lot. But here's the thing, deep sleep, it only lasts for an hour, maybe 2 hours a night if you're lucky. So if you're losing 11 minutes of it every night, come the end of the week with 11 minutes less each night, you've basically missed out on an entire night of deep sleep. So when caffeine is mistimed, your sleep becomes lighter and more disrupted. This then leads to a vicious cycle. You wake up the next morning, you're not feeling great. Then, what's the first thing you reach for? Well, it's more coffee. Then you keep drinking it later into the day. You get into this vicious cycle, and the only way to break it is to cut off caffeine 10 to 12 hours before bed. At that point, the caffeine has mostly worn off, and your body can actually get a deep, high quality sleep. So that's best practice number 2. Stop drinking coffee 10 to 12 hours before bed. This way you can protect your deep sleep so you have better sleep quality and you wake up feeling great. Okay, so now we know exactly how to time coffee in order to maximize energy levels. Next up, let's look at how we can choose the best bean. This is something most people don't put much thought into, but it can make a massive difference. When it comes to bean selection, there are 4 main aspects to consider. The first thing to consider is the type of roast you get. Is a light roast or a dark roast better for you? Well, this is where it gets interesting. When coffee is roasted, the oils inside the bean become oxidized, which means they react with oxygen and become less stable. This can lead to the formation of compounds like acrylamide, a heat-created chemical linked to inflammation, which is considered a potential carcinogen. Many studies have found that acrylamide forms early in the roasting process, then breaks down as roasting continues. This right here would suggest that darker roast might be better. But then in complete contrast, a study published in Food Research International found that light roast coffee had significantly lower acrylamide levels than dark roast. Now just to make things more confusing, there's another compound called furan, which is also considered a potential carcinogen. And unlike acrylamide, furan levels tend to increase with longer roast times. So based on the current science, there isn't exactly a clear winner. Both light and dark roasts come with trade-offs, and neither seems to be drastically better or worse than the other. What does seem to matter more is whether the bean is burnt or overly roasted, because when that happens, the oils become highly oxidized, which further increases the potential for harmful compounds. One thing that's interesting to note is that lighter roasts actually contain more caffeine than darker roasts. This is because caffeine breaks down during the roasting process. So if you are someone who's sensitive to caffeine, that might be one thing you want to consider. So that's best practice number 3. Avoid overly dark or burnt coffee beans. The next thing to consider when it comes to bean selection is whether or not you should get organic. Now, this is going to be a controversial one, but organic is largely a marketing term. A lot of people think organic coffee means pesticide-free coffee, but it doesn't. It simply means the coffee was grown using natural pesticides. But here's the thing. The word natural, it's not clearly defined. Technically speaking, at some point or another, everything's natural. So whilst the term organic does sound healthier, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. That being said, with the growing concerns about the safety of conventional pesticides like glyphosate, I personally think organic beans are still a slightly better option than non-organic. The gold standard is pesticide-free coffee beans. The problem with these, however, is they are very hard to source. So that's best practice number 4. Choose pesticide-free coffee beans if you can, but if not, organic is still likely a slightly better option. However, since organic is also not great, I don't think it matters as much as most people think as to whether or not you get organic. There are much more important factors to consider, such as whether or not the bean contains mold. Luckily, that's what we're going to look at right now. Most people don't know this, but coffee is one of the most mold-prone crops on the planet. The reason mold is such a problem in coffee is because it's often grown in very humid conditions, and then it's not dried properly. This right here creates the perfect environment for mold to thrive. The problem with this mold is it produces toxins like ochratoxin A, which can mess with your gut, your brain, and lead to other health issues. For example, in this study here, they examined the effects of ochratoxin A on the hippocampus, a critical brain region for memory and learning. The study demonstrated that OTA exposure impaired hippocampal neurogenesis in adult mice. Neurogenesis is the process of developing new neurons in the brain. So this study suggests that OTA can adversely affect brain function. And before anyone says, look Max, I'm not a mouse. I know, but the thing with these sorts of studies is that they are impossible to do in humans. You can't just give people mold and see what happens to them. The only real way to test this stuff in humans is through something called vitro studies. This is where they take live human cells and test them outside of the body in a petri dish. And luckily, this has actually been done. In vitro studies on ochratoxin A, it has been shown to damage intestinal epithelial cells. These are the cells that line your gut wall. In simple terms, it weakens your gut barrier and makes it easier for harmful compounds to sneak through, which has been linked to inflammation, immune issues, and gut problems. So based on all research that we can ethically do, it does not sound like this is something you want to be consuming. To avoid mold, if possible, choose coffee that's been lab tested for it. And make sure it's actually lab tested, not just labeled as clean or pure without proof. A lot of people do this. They claim their coffee is pure, but when it gets tested, it doesn't exactly hold up. Another great thing you can do is check where your coffee has come from. If you're buying some random blend from a massive brand, you have absolutely no idea what's in it. You could get a mix of well-handled and well-stored beans in the same packet as some beans that just are full of mold. This right here is why single origin coffee is a better bet. Single origin means it's traceable. You know the region, the farm, sometimes even the altitude it was grown at. Not sure why anyone would care about that, but if you did, you could find out. And traceability usually means better farming practices, and therefore fewer contaminants. So that's best practice number 5. Use beans that are lab tested, mold free, and ideally single origin. The final thing to consider in regards to the type of bean you should use is whether or not you get caffeinated or decaf. This one right here is not as straightforward as most people think. Yes, caffeine can absolutely mess with your sleep, but in many cases, decaffeinated is actually worse. The reason for this is simple. All coffee beans naturally contain caffeine, so in order to make them decaffeinated, the caffeine must be removed. And how it's removed can be a big problem. A lot of the time, the way decaffeinated coffee gets its caffeine stripped is by using chemical solvents like methylene chloride. This stuff right here is an active ingredient in paint stripper, and it's classified as a group 2A carcinogen, meaning it's a probable human carcinogen. These chemical methods leave residues behind on the bean itself. For example, in this study here, 10 of 25 decaffeinated coffee blends were found to have moderate to high levels of methylene chloride. And in the other 15 that methylene chloride wasn't detected in, it doesn't mean that there isn't any in them. It just means that the level was too low to be detected, so it may well still be in there. Unless the caffeine was made using a chemical-free method, like the Swiss water process, which only uses water and temperature, you could be swapping out caffeine for industrial solvents. And here's the other thing, most decaffeinated beans still have a little bit of caffeine in them. So if you're someone super sensitive to caffeine and drink it too close to bed, it can still cause all of these sleep issues that we talked about earlier. Now for some people, caffeine can be more than just disruptive to their sleep. It can actually make them feel seriously anxious. A lot of these people, when they switch from full caffeine to decaf, that anxiety goes away. So why does caffeine affect some people like this? To answer that, you've got to look at why coffee actually contains caffeine in the first place. Caffeine may seem like this glorious gift from nature that wakes us up in the morning, but unfortunately, plants don't care about us. They don't make caffeine so you can have more energy in the mornings. Instead, plants make caffeine in order to survive. Caffeine, by very definition, is a plant defense compound. Its job is quite literally to fry the brains of insects that try to eat it. Now, it doesn't fry our brains because we're a lot larger, but it still puts our body into a mild fight or flight state, which causes hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol to increase. Adrenaline increases heart rate and alertness, and cortisol, along with many other functions, is released in response to stress. This is why for some people, caffeine can cause them serious anxiety. So if you're one of these people who gets anxious drinking caffeinated coffee, decaf is likely a better option, as long as it's decaffeinated naturally, without the use of any of these solvents. But if you don't get anxious from coffee, and you're drinking it for the caffeine anyway, then regular full-strength coffee is totally fine. So that's best practice number 6. Stick to regular caffeinated beans, or if you go decaf, make sure it's naturally decaffeinated using methods like the Swiss water process. Okay, so now we know everything there is to know about timing coffee as well as bean selection. The next thing to consider is how to make your coffee so it doesn't destroy your gut health, cause you anxiety, and result in you having to run to the bathroom. Coffee beans can cause a number of people a lot of problems in these regards, so let's discuss how we can minimize these issues. Coffee obviously comes from a plant, and like all plants, it contains defense compounds. These are chemicals plants use to defend themselves from being eaten. Caffeine, which we've already talked about, is one of these. The problem with these compounds is that some of them can cause great irritation in our guts. A great example is tannins. By definition, tannins are a plant defense compound that binds to proteins. Because every cell in our gut, or in any part of our body for that matter, has protein molecules on the outside of them. Tannins can bind to our gut lining, which then causes inflammation. And when your gut becomes inflamed, it can lead to all sorts of issues. Acne, digestive issues, it even can cause anxiety. Now you might be sitting there and thinking, how on earth would this cause me to have anxiety? Well, one way it does this is due to serotonin and dopamine. These are two key hormones, slash neurotransmitters that have a massive impact on your overall mood and anxiety levels. Around 50% of dopamine and over 90% of serotonin are produced in your gut. So if your gut's inflamed, your ability to make these feel-good chemicals, it significantly reduces. Now you can't fully protect yourself from these compounds. Unfortunately, they're in every cup. But what you can do is reduce the damage they're causing by making one simple change. And that is to not drink coffee on an empty stomach. When you eat before drinking a cup of coffee, this food can line your gut a bit. It acts as sort of a barrier. Now what this barrier does is it can prevent some of the defense compounds that are in coffee from binding to your gut. So for many people, you can mitigate the effects of coffee by drinking beforehand. However, in saying that, there are some people that are just so sensitive to the defense compounds in coffee that even doing this may not be enough. So it's not a perfect way to prevent any gut damage from coffee, but it can certainly help. Another thing having food in your system does is it makes the effects of caffeine less intense. This is because, at least to some degree, it absorbs the caffeine. So if you are someone who gets really anxious drinking coffee, eating beforehand could definitely be a good idea. So that's best practice number 7. If you're dealing with acne, joint pain, or even anxiety, try waiting until after your first meal to have coffee. Now we know the best practices when it comes to coffee selection. But there is one final factor that we haven't discussed, and that is, what should you add to your coffee? This is where I see so many people go wrong. I've seen people make just one simple change to what they put in their coffee, and their skin clears up, their body fat starts dropping, even despite nothing else in their routine changing. Firstly, there's the option of black coffee, which you sound like a bit of a G when you order it. It's definitely a good option. But the thing is that most people prefer to add something to their coffee. I know I do. In my opinion, black coffee, it tastes a bit bitter. Now, typically people will add one of 5 main things: milk, cream, or butter, as well as oat or soy juice. Now, I'm sure there's a few people sitting there thinking that I misspoke. Wrong. I chose my words very carefully. Have you ever seen oats or soybeans be milked? Of course you haven't. They don't contain milk. Oat and soy milk is oat and soy juice blended with water, seed oils, sugar, and a bunch of other additives combined together and then labeled with the highly marketable term of milk. This juice right here is terrible for your health. Seed oils are one of the most problematic foods for humans to consume. Honestly, they might be the most problematic. Firstly, seeds are the most defended part of a plant. They are the plant's offspring. So in order to ensure it can successfully reproduce, these things are packed with the highest concentration of plant defense compounds. And here's the thing with seed oils. It's not like you're only consuming very small amounts of seeds like you are when you're consuming coffee beans. And yes, technically speaking, beans are seeds, by the way. Because there is not much oil in a single seed, you need massive quantities of them. Then they are put through an 11-step process where you heat them, cool them, deodorize them, degum them, bleach them. In the end, what you're left with is an oil that humans historically have never consumed, meaning we have not adapted to consume it. It's also incredibly high in inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids, such as linoleic acid. And last, but certainly not least, it's also incredibly unstable, meaning it breaks down easily when exposed to oxygen, even at room temperature, which then forms harmful compounds that damage your cells and promote inflammation. And this right here is only one of a long list of terrible ingredients that these juices contain. So make sure at all costs you avoid these juices. Instead, you should add some sort of animal product, either milk, cream, or butter. So let's look into what's best. And for you people that are lactose intolerant, don't worry, I've got you covered. The problem with cream and butter is that in many cases they can stall weight loss, simply because they are ridiculously high in energy. Having 200 mils of cream or 100 grams of butter in your coffee is equivalent to having over a litre of milk in terms of energy. Remember, body fat is simply excess stored energy. So if you're consuming high amounts of energy, your body draws less energy from its fat reserves. This right here is why butter and cream can stall fat loss for many people. So if your goal is fat loss, milk is probably your best option. However, milk can cause problems for some people. Certainly does for me. Whenever I drink pasteurized milk, which is just regular store-bought milk, my skin, it completely breaks out. The reason for this is when dairy is pasteurized, it is heated to high temperatures. The reason they do this is to kill bacteria, which then allows it to stay shelf stable for longer. The issue with this is dairy proteins are very sensitive to heat. When exposed to high temperatures, they begin to denature. and once that happens, they can become inflammatory in the body. It also causes an enzyme called lactase to be broken down. Lactase is what breaks down the primary sugar in dairy called lactose. This makes pasteurized dairy much harder to digest for many people and can result in them having to run to the bathroom. So for many people, including myself, pasteurized dairy isn't ideal. Raw dairy, on the other hand, is a great option. Raw dairy has not been pasteurized, so the proteins in it aren't denatured, and it still contains that lactase. This right here is why many people can drink raw dairy without any problems, but as soon as they have pasteurized dairy, it results in a few unpleasant symptoms. The thing with raw dairy, however, is that it's not available in most places. From where I'm from in New Zealand, it's actually very hard to source. You would think that, being a small nation based around farming, it would be very easy to find this stuff, but somehow, nope, I really struggle to find it. You might be wondering, if you're someone who can't source raw milk and pasteurized milk, that seems to cause you issues. What should you add? Well, in this case, it actually might be better to add butter or cream. You can have these things without them ruining your fat loss if you don't have too much of them. The thing with butter and cream is that they are just the fat from milk. So the problems we talked about earlier in regards to inflammation, they don't apply. It is the sugar and protein content in dairy that typically causes most people problems. So there are lots of people who can't have pasteurized milk, but when they have pasteurized butter or cream, it seems to be fine. When I have pasteurized cream or butter, my skin is great, which is the complete opposite to what happens when I have pasteurized milk. Again, my only concern with these things is that they're very high in energy. If you're someone who's not looking to lose weight, then these things are great options. But if you are someone who is trying to lose some fat and you still want to enjoy your coffee in the morning, what I recommend is having a very small amount of either butter or cream in your coffee. For me personally, when I have coffee, I have about 10 to 30 mils of cream. This right here gets rid of that bitter black taste. It still results in it tasting nice, but it's not ridiculously high in energy where it either stalls your fat loss or causes you to gain weight. But as a whole, there isn't a clear-cut answer for this one. It's more person to person dependent. Raw dairy is definitely the best bet, but again, it can be hard to source. So that's principle number 8. Be selective on what you add to your coffee and choose what's best for your goals. Now, I do have one final bonus tip for those who want to be as healthy as possible, and that is ideally you don't want to drink from plastic cups. With takeaway coffee cups, they may look like they're paper, but more often than not, there's actually a layer of plastic on the inside. This is problematic as hot water can cause plastic parts to leach chemicals like BPA and phthalates into your drink, which have been demonstrated to cause hormonal disruption, reproductive toxicity, and development issues in animal and human studies. For example, a study published in Environmental Health Perspectives found that BPA exposure, even at low doses, can mimic estrogen and interfere with the endocrine system. So drinking from a stainless steel or ceramic cup is definitely your best bet if you can. However, if we're being honest, a lot of the time this just isn't possible. If you're on the go getting coffee, you don't really have this option, which is why this is just a bonus tip rather than part of the 8 best practices. However, you can also apply this at home. A lot of people use kettles that are internally lined with plastic. So if you're making your coffee at home, ideally have a kettle that is made from stainless steel. To summarize so you can remember everything from this video, if you want to make your coffee as healthy as possible, here are the best practices. Delay caffeine intake 90 to 120 minutes if you find it causes an afternoon energy crash. Stop drinking coffee 10 to 12 hours before bed. In my opinion, this is the most important thing to do. Avoid super dark roasts. Choose pesticide-free beans if you can, but if not, organic is the next best option. Use beans that are lab-tested, mold-free, and ideally single origin. Stick to regular caffeinated beans, or if you are using decaf, make sure it's naturally decaffeinated using methods like the Swiss water process. If you're dealing with acne, joint pain, or anxiety, try waiting until after your first meal to have coffee. Be selective with what you add to your coffee and choose the option that is best aligned to your goals. Finally, try to avoid drinking from plastic. One thing a lot of people add to their coffee is sugar, but in my opinion, you'd be a lot better off without it. If you were to quit sugar for just 30 days, I can almost guarantee you would feel and look a lot better. So in this video right here, I break down exactly what would happen to you if you were to quit sugar for 30 days. Anyways, as always, I enjoyed speaking with you. See you next time.